Hey, I'm Michael Hoff with Digital Theologian, and today I want to talk to you about Geert Grote and the Brothers and Sisters of the Common Life. This is a movement that shaped history in a number of ways, and even though it didn't last for a very long time, their influence was felt throughout the Reformation. And so I think that they are well worth our consideration. Now, if you found this channel because of Bible content, I want to encourage you to be sure to check out some of my other videos, especially the recent series that I've done about the Bible. But today, I want to help answer some questions for people who were like me. When I was in high school, I wondered, how did we go from Jesus and the disciples to the church that I was worshiping in today? And there was this gap that nobody seemed to be able to fill, that went from the time of Jesus and what we saw in the New Testament, and then it was like this big cloud that nobody could pierce, nobody could see through, that went from then all the way until maybe Billy Graham, maybe a little bit before, right? Because some of the people in the congregation were a little older and could remember more, but it basically went from Jesus to the people that they could remember. And so it's so valuable for us to explore and to mine the wealth of Christian tradition. And as I'm working on a PhD in renewal theology with a concentration in church history, man, I have had the opportunity to study renewal movements, revivals, Reformation movements, these groups that have done well, these groups that have looked at the church and have said, you know what, we need to get back to the earliest sources. We need to get back to Jesus. We need to get back to Scripture. We need to understand what was going on in the early church and try to pattern our lives after what they had done then. And as groups have done that in a variety of different ways throughout history, the church has been renewed. And so I want to help share some of that with you. So I want to kick off this new series of Christians You Should Know with Geert Grote and the Brothers and Sisters of the Common Life. Born in 1340, Geert was the son of Werner Grote, a burgomeister and cloth merchant in Deventer. He was raised around wealth and power. This is his father. Werner was somebody and he had political influence and he had the money to back it up. But in 1350, the plague swept through Deventer and both of Geert's parents were killed. This loss of his parents to the plague at the age of 10 is one of the most shaping moments of Geert's life. You can see the traces of it later, as he was somebody at the age of 10 who was friendless and alone, who had to be put into the care of his uncle. He, as an older man, takes orphans and young men who seem to be friendless under his wing, provides a space for them to learn, and becomes their mentor. This is the foundation of his educational model, is a care for people who find themselves without parents, without those who can champion them. And while Geert had privilege and power behind him, as he lost the influence of his parents, he saw what it was like to be truly alone in the world, and that motivated him to take others under his wing in much the way that his uncle, who was a priest, took Geert under his. From the time he was 15 until he was 34, Grote found himself in educational institutions in a variety of European cities. Whether it was in Deventer or Aachen or Cologne or Paris, he was being educated at some of the best institutions that Western Europe had to offer. Grote was being educated and molded and shaped by some of the brightest minds of Europe during this era. And you can see that he had a bright academic career. He was flourishing during this time frame. Grote saw canon law as the best way to advance in the church. He was looking for a career in the church and knew that if he could secure himself prebends, these profitable positions within the church, then he would be well on his way to having an established life moving forward. He studied natural philosophy, medicine, civil law, and a variety of other subjects, but ultimately it was canon law that he focused on because he saw it as so essential to securing a profitable life moving forward. During this time, Grote secured 2 profitable prebends, and it seemed like his career was on the rise. He was well on his way to achieving that life of luxury. Looking back on this time, Grote's estimation wasn't nearly as positive as those around him. He said that he was fornicating on every hilltop and under every spreading tree. That is not a positive quote from the Bible, right? Like, if you're going to describe your life and it's in glowing terms, it's probably not using that phrase. 1374 was a year that changed Geert Grote's life. He had two specific encounters that transformed him early on, and then a conversation with a friend that really cemented those encounters. The first was when he encountered a street mystic who called him out and told him to stop living an empty lifestyle. The second encounter came just a few months later when Geert fell ill and his uncle, Johannes Okenbroek, came to help care for him. He called on Geert to give up his books on magic and to take the Eucharist, to celebrate communion. And that is exactly what he did. It was shortly after this encounter with his uncle that Geert decided to give up his own rights to his property and set up his home as a house for devout women. And he went on to help them establish a rule for life and became their first director, their spiritual director. So he has gone in a very short period of time from being someone who was fornicating under every tree now to being somebody who has given up his property for the sake of the gospel to bring in those who are following Jesus, those who are devout, and give them a place to live and help them to establish a devout rule of life. The final transformative event was a conversation in October of 1375 with a good friend, Henry of Calcar. And it was following this conversation that Geert felt the need to give up these profitable church positions that he had lobbied so hard for. So he ends up giving up both the property that his family left him and these profitable church positions that he had spent years trying to acquire through his academic career. Now, Geert Grote was set up to begin pursuing an austere spiritual life patterned after Jesus and the early church. And this is what marks the rest of his life. One of Grote's remaining writings is Intentions and Resolutions but Not Vows. And in the opening paragraph of that, he says, I intend to order my life to the glory and honor and service of God, and to the salvation of my soul, to put no temporal good of body, position, fortune, or learning ahead of my soul's salvation, and to pursue the imitation of God in every way, consonant with learning and discernment, with my own body and estate, which predispose certain forms of imitation. After 1374, it is clear throughout Grote's writings that he is pushing back against so much of what had made him successful up until that point. He chooses to live a life of austerity. He's seeking to live a life that is patterned after Jesus and the early church and goes beyond just standard normal church attendance. Being a part of a Christian nation isn't enough. Being a part of Christendom as a whole and that part of Europe during that time frame was insufficient. For him, the Christian life needed to be patterned after Jesus and to go deep. It required sacrifice and self-denial and austerity. It was done in community and connection with others and required other believers. It's almost as though he read Acts 2:42, where he sees the disciples devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, to prayer, to the breaking of bread together. The heart of Grote's ministry were a series of preaching tours that he went on from late in 1379 through the fall of 1382. During this time, he started preaching to the laity in Latin and to common people in Dutch. And throughout these preaching tours, it wasn't uncommon for him to preach 2 or 3 times a day, and some of the sermons were as long as 3 hours. He traveled around the country and preached numerous times in numerous places and gathered large crowds. And he saw that he was reaching a number of people, but in the midst of this process, he recognized that there were people who would never come to his sermons. There were people that he would just never be able to reach with his message. And so he started to befriend some of those people along the way. He began to take them under his wing, much in the same way that his uncle had taken him under his wing. And he began to give them jobs where he was teaching them to write, and then he was helping them to dictate what his letters were or to make copies of books, and we began to pay them. And for others, he started to pay them to help carry around the barrels full of books that he would take with him on his preaching tours. Now, I love how he, in many ways, rejects academics and the intellectual study without a connection to spirituality, and still, in the midst of that, takes barrels of books with him on his preaching tours. I love this. It's amazing, right? Because you think, oh, he's totally rejected academics and the university, and he's pushing back against that, and he's rejected this former way of life, and still he has a value for education and for learning and for knowledge, so much that he's taking barrels full of books with him as he travels across Europe preaching. He has continuing value for those that aren't going to hear his sermons, and ultimately, he works to help establish schools. Nearly a quarter of the letters that we have that remaining from Grote were written to headmasters of either universities or schools. He was trying to build a network of educators and connect them together, and truly to lay a good foundation for a spiritual method of education. And he was successful. Unfortunately, Grote dies early. The plague swept through the region where he was, and Grote decided that he needed to, as a follower of Christ, care for victims of the plague. And it was in that time that he contracted the plague himself and died. But through the disciples that he had made on these preaching tours, through the women and the devout communities that were established in Deventer and other places of men and women who weren't monks, but had chosen as common average believers to live lives of intentional devotion to Jesus, man, they began to lay down a foundation and a blueprint for schools that have shaped Germany, England, the Netherlands, the United States to this day. Beyond possibly preserving an entire nation from economic collapse during the Middle Ages, the schools founded by Grote and his followers also trained the likes of Thomas of Kempen, Erasmus of Rotterdam, Nicholas of Cusa, Pope Adrian VI, Martin Luther, and John Calvin. There are few Christians today who do not trace some spiritual influence to someone that studied under the sisters and brothers of the common life. Their value for education, combined with a pure desire to seek the words of Jesus and to live after the pattern of the early church, has made a lasting impact on history. So that's why you should know Geert Grote and the brothers and sisters of the common life.